Okay, cool. So this video is part 2 of Western Alpinids and part 2 of the Alpinid playlist. And this concerns German Alpinids and Subnordids from Germany and peripheries, as well as from elsewhere in Europe, really. So, first we start with a couple typical Alpinid examples, and then we get more onto the Subnordid, which I've already covered in the peripheral Nordids Subnordic video. It's the first part of 3 there. Yeah, let's get into the Alpinids first, and then we'll move into the ones where you can see the Nordic and other influences. So, this is, Kuhn actually comments on this fellow and says that he's morphologically perfect Alpinid, which means that the features of his skull, not just his total measurements, his metrics, but his morphology, so the processes on the bone and that sort of thing are perfectly Alpinid. So this fellow has very little of other influences. And he's from Brandenburg. And this fellow here is a Bavarian from Hirschenberg in Upper Bavaria. And he's curly haired, and he's said to be very typical of the Bavarian racial type in general. So there are 2 very good examples of the Alpine. Now, straight away, we get into the Nordic influenced, and this fellow is just mentioned as an Alpinid, but as you can see by his skull, his occiput is high and pronounced, even though it may well be planoccipital at the back there, and his forehead is more sloping than is typical of an Alpinid as well. So you can see it facially, but again, the forehead and the occiput show that there is some other influence. This fellow is from the Black Forest, so yeah, he's from a little further north, so it's not surprising that he would have some Nordic influence there. Okay, that concludes the Alpine proper section, even though that last fellow, as you can see, already has some influences. So these are more Subnordids. They're not as typical examples of Subnordids as the ones in the Subnordid video. One of them is the same, and I'll include him last. So the first one here is very far afield from Germany. The others are quite near. This guy is a Basque, and the Basque largely belong to a special subtype, which could be characterized either as Celtic Nordid or Dinerid, called the Basket. But this fellow, it doesn't show the denarisization that is characteristic of the Basque, and he's a fairly standard Alpinid. But again, he's blonde, and he was freckly and had rufosity of the skin, so that's rosiness, reddishness as a child. So you can see the Celtic blood is represented strongly there. So he could be argued to be Subnordid on account of pigmentation, but again, his skull is largely Alpinid. So then we move on to this fellow. This fellow is a Bohemian Czech. He could almost be argued to be representative of a Gorid that we talk about in the next section. The reason I've included him here is because you can see his occiput is not typical. He's not actually planoccipital as an Alpinid should be, but he's curvoccipital. So there's some flattening of the back of the skull, but he's a lot longer skulled. Kuhn even states that he's less brachycephal. But anyway, Bohemian Czech, belonging to the Subnordid type. Okay, then here is a Walloon. So the Walloons are French-speaking people, French people. They are maybe the best descendants of the Belgae, so the kind of northern periphery of the Celtic confederations, but they have some Germanic lineages. They're part of Belgium, which is a state that's majority Flemish, majority Dutch. And yeah, again, his skull is mostly Alpinid, but you can see that his occiput there is a little bit raised. He does have a tucked skull, which is a feature I'll explain at some point. It's supposed to be a feature of modern Homo sapiens, but it isn't a feature of all types. And Neanderthal, most Nordids, and many Meds tend to have much higher occipits, as you've already seen in some of the ones I've mentioned here. Now we move to a totally different kind of Subnordid. So this fellow likely has some Cro-Magnon somewhere in the mix as well, though it doesn't express strongly. It's probably a residual. But you can see he does have the planoccipital thing going on. But yeah, his skull is not of the typically round alpine shape. It's a little bit atypical. You can see the squarishness a little bit in his face as well. So he's from Doubs in Burgundy. So again, he's from a region of France that has a lot of Germanic blood. The east and the north of France are where Germanic blood is the highest. And oh, just an interesting note, R1A peaks in east of France, whereas most other Germanic lineages peak in the north. But yeah, there's the secondary peak in the east. Both have a good amount of Germanic blood. And here is the German, the ethnic German from Spreewald, who I showed before. And I'm not sure if I mentioned in the other video on Subnordids, but he's said particularly to be subnordid, to be transitional to nordid, on account of the fineness of his skull. So the narrowness, and if you look at the detail in the sides of the temples there, that's compressed lobes, a particularly nordid feature. And you can also see in the occiput there, the occiput is high and jutting, very unlike the typical alpine type.